I was just trying to help my elderly parents save money on their plumbing repair, wearing an old sweater and jeans, looking like any other adult daughter dealing with household maintenance. But when I mentioned getting a second quote, the plumber laughed right in my face and made a comment that still makes my blood boil. What he didn't know was that the business card sitting on my mother's kitchen counter wasn't just any business card. It had my real title on it. And when he finally saw it, the color drained from his face so fast I thought he might need medical attention. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other Saturday when you're the designated family problem solver. Mom called around 7, her voice carrying that familiar mix of frustration and helplessness that comes with aging homeowners facing unexpected repairs. The kitchen sink had been leaking for 3 days, and despite Dad's best efforts with YouTube tutorials and hardware store advice, the situation had only gotten worse. Now there was water damage spreading across the cabinet floor, and they needed professional help. I drove over in my old Honda, still wearing the comfortable clothes I'd thrown on for what I expected to be a day of family errands. Nothing fancy, just a well-worn navy sweater that had seen better days, faded jeans with a small paint stain from last year's garage project, and the kind of practical sneakers that say, "I'm here to work, not impress anyone." My hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and I'd grabbed my reading glasses because I knew I'd be looking at estimates and paperwork. Mom and Dad were waiting in the driveway when I arrived, both looking relieved to see me. At 73 and 75, respectively, they'd reached that stage where home maintenance problems felt overwhelming rather than manageable. Dad still thought he could handle everything himself, but his arthritis made detailed work difficult, and Mom worried constantly about the costs of professional repairs on their fixed income. The plumber they'd called was already there, a stocky man in his early 40s with Rodriguez Plumbing embroidered on his work shirt. He had the kind of swagger that suggested he was used to being the expert in the room, the one everyone deferred to because he had the knowledge they needed. His van was parked prominently in the driveway, magnetic signs advertising 24-hour service and 15 years of experience. I introduced myself simply as their daughter, Sarah, and explained that I'd be handling the business side of things while they dealt with the repair decisions. Rodriguez barely acknowledged me, giving the kind of dismissive nod that men sometimes reserve for women they assume don't understand technical matters. He was already focused on my parents, launching into an explanation of the problem that included more technical terminology than necessary and a tone that suggested this was all very complicated and expensive. The issue, according to Rodriguez, was serious. The leak hadn't just damaged the cabinet floor, it had potentially compromised the entire undersink plumbing system. The shutoff valves were corroded, the supply lines were outdated, and the disposal connection was failing. What had started as a simple leak repair had become a complete system overhaul that would require multiple days of work and premium materials. His estimate was staggering, $4,000 for what he called a complete kitchen plumbing restoration. The number hit my parents like a physical blow, and I watched Dad's shoulders sag as he calculated how much of their savings this would consume. Mom's face went pale, and she started that nervous habit of wringing her hands that she'd developed since her last health scare. That's when I made what Rodriguez apparently considered a rookie mistake. I asked if we could get a second opinion before moving forward with such an extensive and expensive repair. After all, $4,000 represented a significant portion of my parents' emergency fund, and I wanted to make sure we were making the right decision for both the repair and their financial security. Rodriguez's reaction was immediate and condescending. He laughed, not the friendly chuckle of someone who understood my concern, but the dismissive laugh of someone who thought I was naive and out of my depth. "Lady," he said, shaking his head with exaggerated patience, "this isn't like shopping for a new purse. You can't just price compare plumbing work like you're buying groceries." The comment stung, not just because of its obvious sexism, but because of the assumption behind it. He saw a middle-aged woman in casual clothes asking about costs and immediately categorized me as someone who didn't understand how serious business worked. Someone who needed to be educated about the reality of professional services and the folly of trying to save money on essential repairs. "Your parents called me because they need expert work," he continued, his voice taking on the patient tone people use when they're explaining something to a child. "I've been doing this for 15 years. I know what needs to be done, and I know what it costs. Getting a second quote just means starting this whole process over again, wasting time while the damage gets worse." He gestured toward the kitchen with the authority of someone who expected his expertise to end all discussion. "Water damage doesn't wait for bargain shopping. Every day you delay, the problem gets more expensive. I'm trying to save you money in the long run by fixing this right the first time." My parents looked between us, clearly uncomfortable with the tension but unsure how to proceed. Dad valued professional expertise and didn't want to offend someone whose services they needed. Mom was calculating costs in her head, trying to figure out how to make the numbers work without completely depleting their savings. Neither of them wanted to make the wrong decision, but $4,000 was a frightening amount for people living on Social Security and pension payments. I pressed gently, explaining that I wasn't questioning his expertise, but simply wanted to ensure we were making a fully informed decision. "I understand this is serious work," I said carefully, "but $4,000 is a significant expense for them. Wouldn't it be reasonable to get one more opinion before committing to such a large project?" Rodriguez's condescension shifted into something approaching irritation. "Look, I get it," he said, his tone becoming more pointed. "You're trying to be a good daughter, watching out for mom and dad's money. That's sweet. But this is the real world, not some home improvement show where everything gets fixed with duct tape and good intentions." He pulled out his phone and started showing me pictures of similar jobs, speaking slowly and clearly as if I might not understand complex concepts like water pressure and pipe corrosion. "These are premium fixtures," he explained, pointing to various components on his screen. "Commercial-grade shutoff valves, reinforced supply lines, professional-grade sealants. This isn't Home Depot weekend warrior stuff. This is the kind of work that lasts decades." The more he talked, the more apparent it became that he saw me as an obstacle to overcome rather than a customer to serve. Every question I asked was met with increasing impatience. Every concern I raised was dismissed as evidence of my ignorance about plumbing realities. He began speaking primarily to my father, directing technical explanations toward him while treating me like a well-meaning but naive interruption to serious business discussions. When I asked about the specific necessity of replacing components that appeared to be functioning properly, Rodriguez actually rolled his eyes. "Ma'am, with respect, plumbing isn't like changing a light bulb. There are safety codes, water pressure requirements, compatibility issues between different system components. I can't just patch things together and hope for the best because that's what fits someone's budget." The phrase "someone's budget" was delivered with particular emphasis, as if my concern about costs was evidence of misguided priorities rather than reasonable financial planning. He continued explaining why every component needed to be replaced, why every aspect of his quote was essential, why anyone who suggested otherwise simply didn't understand the complexity of modern plumbing systems. My parents were becoming increasingly overwhelmed by the technical discussion and the financial pressure. Mom kept glancing toward the kitchen where she could hear water dripping, a constant reminder that the problem was getting worse while we talked. Dad was nodding along with Rodriguez's explanations, wanting to trust the professional but clearly worried about the cost implications. That's when Rodriguez made his biggest mistake. Sensing that my parents were ready to move forward despite their financial concerns, he decided to remove what he saw as the final obstacle to closing the deal. "Maybe your daughter could step outside while we finalize the details," he suggested to my father. Sometimes family members who aren't familiar with construction costs can make these decisions more complicated than they need to be. The suggestion was delivered politely, but the implication was clear. He wanted to exclude me from the decision-making process because he viewed me as an uninformed interference in a transaction between professionals and people who understood the necessity of expert work. In his mind, I was the emotional family member who prioritized saving money over solving problems correctly. I felt my jaw tighten, but I maintained my composure. "I appreciate your concern," I said evenly, "but I'll be staying involved in any decisions about my parents' home repairs. We're still interested in getting that second opinion." Rodriguez's patience finally cracked completely. "Fine," he said, throwing his hands up in frustration. "Waste your time calling around, getting quotes from guys who'll tell you what you want to hear instead of what you need to know. But don't call me back when their cheap fix fails in 6 months and you're dealing with flood damage." He started gathering his tools with theatrical irritation, making sure we understood that our unreasonable demands had forced him to waste his valuable time. "I've got paying customers who understand the value of professional work," he muttered loud enough for us to hear, "people who don't try to turn everything into a negotiation." That's when my mother, bless her heart, tried to smooth things over by offering him coffee and mentioning that I'd just gotten back from overseas. She was making conversation, trying to ease the tension, explaining that I'd been traveling for work and had only recently returned home to help with family matters. "Oh yeah?" Rodriguez asked with perfunctory politeness, clearly not interested, but willing to make small talk while he packed up. "Vacation somewhere nice?" "Work assignment," I replied simply. "What kind of work takes you overseas?" he asked, his tone suggesting he expected to hear about some mundane corporate job or educational conference. That's when my mother, proud as always of her daughter's career, mentioned that I worked in logistics and operations management. She gestured toward the kitchen counter where I'd set my briefcase and business cards earlier, the same way she always did when she wanted to brag about her children's accomplishments to visitors. Rodriguez glanced over dismissively, then did a double-take. His eyes focused on the business cards sitting next to the coffee pot, and I watched his expression change as he read the text that my mother had been looking at proudly all morning. "Colonel Sarah Anderson, United States Army, Strategic Operations Command." The color drained from his face so rapidly I thought he might actually faint. His hands stopped moving, his tools forgotten, as he processed what he was seeing. The business card that had been sitting in plain sight throughout our entire interaction suddenly recontextualized everything that had happened over the past hour. "You're Colonel Anderson?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," I replied simply.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Rodriguez stared at the card for several more seconds, then looked back at me with completely different eyes. Gone was the condescending expert talking down to an ignorant civilian. In his place stood a man who suddenly understood that he'd been lecturing a senior military officer about leadership and decision-making while dismissing her concerns as naive and uninformed. "Ma'am," he said, his entire demeanor transformed, I didn't realize." I didn't respond immediately. Let him process the situation fully. Let him understand the implications of how he'd treated not just a customer, but someone whose professional life involved managing logistics operations with budgets that made his $4,000 estimate look like pocket change. Someone who'd spent decades making critical decisions under pressure, coordinating complex projects, and evaluating expert recommendations in situations where mistakes had far more serious consequences than household repairs. "I've been managing operational logistics for the United States Army for 22 years, I said quietly. "I've overseen equipment installations in forward operating bases, coordinated supply chain management for multi-million-dollar projects, and evaluated technical recommendations from contractors in environments where lives depended on getting things right the first time." Rodriguez looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. His swagger had completely evaporated, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that he'd spent the last hour condescending to someone whose professional expertise in project management and resource allocation far exceeded his own. "When I ask for a second opinion," I continued, "it's not because I don't understand the complexity of the work or the importance of quality materials. It's because responsible project management involves gathering sufficient information to make informed decisions, especially when those decisions affect people I care about. My parents watched this exchange with growing amazement. They'd known I had a successful military career, but they'd never seen me operate in my professional capacity. They were getting their first glimpse of the person who'd spent 2 decades commanding respect in rooms full of engineers, contractors, and senior officials. Rodriguez cleared his throat nervously. "Colonel Anderson, ma'am, I sincerely apologize for the way I had no idea who you were." "You shouldn't need to know who I am," I replied. "You should treat every customer with the same respect and professionalism regardless of their background or their concerns about costs." He nodded rapidly, clearly uncomfortable but unable to argue with the logic. "Yes, ma'am, absolutely. You're completely right. My parents are on a fixed income," I continued. "When they express concern about a $4,000 repair, that's not ignorance about plumbing costs. That's genuine financial constraint from people who've worked hard their entire lives and deserve to have their concerns taken seriously." "Of course, ma'am, I understand completely." The transformation in Rodriguez's attitude was remarkable to witness. The same man who'd been dismissing my questions minutes earlier was now hanging on every word, nodding earnestly at observations he'd previously ridiculed. His body language had shifted from condescending authority to respectful attention, and his tone carried the careful deference of someone who realized he'd made a serious professional mistake. "Now," I said, maintaining the calm but authoritative tone that had served me well in countless military briefings, "let's discuss this repair project from the beginning. I'd like you to walk me through each component of your estimate, explain the specific necessity of each replacement, and provide detailed justification for your recommended approach." Rodriguez pulled out his paperwork with hands that were noticeably less steady than they'd been an hour earlier. "Yes, ma'am, absolutely. I'd be happy to go through everything in detail." For the next 30 minutes, I asked the kinds of probing questions that any experienced project manager would ask when evaluating a major contractor proposal. I wanted to understand not just what needed to be done, but why each component was necessary, what alternatives existed, and how his approach compared to other possible solutions. Under this level of scrutiny, Rodriguez's estimate began to look significantly different. Several components he'd described as essential were actually preventative upgrades rather than immediate necessities. The premium materials he'd specified were certainly high quality, but standard commercial alternatives would serve my parents' needs perfectly well at a fraction of the cost. When I asked about phased implementation, allowing us to address the most critical issues immediately while deferring less urgent upgrades, Rodriguez admitted that such an approach would be perfectly reasonable. The emergency repairs could be completed for under $800, with additional improvements handled over time as budget allowed. "Why didn't you present these options initially?" I asked. Rodriguez looked uncomfortable. "Well, ma'am, most homeowners prefer comprehensive solutions rather than piecemeal approaches. It's usually more cost-effective in the long run to handle everything at once." "But you didn't explain that reasoning or offer alternatives for people with different financial constraints?" "No, ma'am, I should have." My parents listened to this revised discussion with relief and growing confidence. Instead of facing a financial emergency, they were learning about practical solutions that addressed their immediate needs while respecting their budget limitations. Dad began asking informed questions about the repair process, and Mom started taking notes about maintenance steps that could prevent future problems. When Rodriguez finished his revised explanation, I thanked him for his thoroughness and told him we'd be contacting him within 24 hours with our decision. He packed up his tools with considerably more humility than he'd displayed earlier, apologizing again for the misunderstanding and promising that any work he performed would exceed our expectations. After he left, my parents and I sat in the kitchen drinking coffee and reviewing the information we'd gathered. They were amazed by the difference in Rodriguez's approach once he understood who he was talking to, but they were also troubled by the implications. How many people get taken advantage of because contractors assume they don't know any better? Mom wondered aloud. It was a good question. How many elderly homeowners, young families, or anyone who didn't project professional authority got pressured into expensive repairs they didn't need? How many people paid premium prices because they were afraid to ask questions or request alternatives? We did get that second opinion from a smaller plumbing company recommended by their neighbor. The second estimate confirmed that the immediate repair needs were relatively modest, exactly as I'd suspected. The comprehensive system overhaul Rodriguez had recommended might be worth considering eventually, but it wasn't the emergency he'd portrayed. My parents chose to work with the second contractor who completed the essential repairs for $750 and provided them with a detailed maintenance schedule to prevent future problems. The work was professional, efficient, and exactly what they needed. Rodriguez called 3 days later to follow up on his estimate. When I explained that they'd decided to work with another contractor, he was politely disappointed but didn't pressure us to reconsider. His tone remained respectful throughout the conversation, a stark contrast to his initial approach. The experience reminded me why I'd always valued straightforward communication and honest assessment in my military career. Whether you're evaluating equipment proposals from defense contractors or plumbing estimates for your parents' kitchen, the principles remain the same. Ask questions, seek alternatives, and never let anyone dismiss your concerns simply because they claim superior expertise. My parents learned something valuable too. They realized that their daughter's professional skills transferred perfectly to civilian situations, and they gained confidence in their own ability to make informed decisions about their home maintenance needs. Dad started researching contractors more thoroughly before calling them, and Mom began asking detailed questions about repair estimates instead of simply accepting expert recommendations. The story might have ended there, but Rodriguez surprised me by calling again 2 weeks later. This time, he wasn't following up on business. He wanted to apologize more thoroughly and explain how the experience had changed his approach with other customers. "Colonel Anderson," he said, "I've been thinking about our conversation, and I realize I treated you poorly before I knew who you were. That was wrong, and it made me think about how I treat other customers who might not have your background or confidence to push back on my recommendations." He explained that he'd started presenting multiple options to all his customers, explaining the differences between essential repairs and optional upgrades, and taking time to understand each family's financial situation before making recommendations. "I never realized how intimidating I might seem to people who don't know anything about plumbing," he admitted. It was a gratifying conversation, not because of the personal apology, but because it suggested that one uncomfortable encounter might lead to better treatment for future customers who couldn't advocate for themselves as effectively. The whole experience reinforced something I'd learned throughout my military career. Respect shouldn't be contingent on rank, title, or perceived authority. Professional competence means treating every interaction with the same level of consideration, whether you're dealing with a general officer or a private soldier, a corporate executive, or a retiree on a fixed income. Too often we make assumptions about people based on their appearance, their concerns, or their questions. The woman asking about costs might be a financial expert. The quiet person in casual clothes might have more professional experience than everyone else in the room. The elderly couple worried about expensive repairs might have spent their lives making careful decisions about complex problems. My parents still tell this story to their friends, usually with pride about their daughter's career, but also with amusement about Rodriguez's transformation once he realized who he was dealing with. They've become more confident consumers, asking detailed questions and seeking multiple opinions on major purchases. Rodriguez has stayed in touch occasionally, sending holiday cards and updates about his business. He mentions that his customer service approach has improved his reputation in the community, leading to more referrals and repeat business. Treating people with respect, he discovered, was not just morally right, but also good for business. Sometimes the most important lessons come from moments when we're forced to examine our assumptions about other people. Rodriguez learned that professional expertise doesn't justify condescending behavior. My parents learned that they could trust their instincts about major financial decisions. And I was reminded that military leadership skills translate perfectly to civilian situations where clear communication and respectful advocacy make all the difference. The kitchen sink works perfectly now, by the way. $750 of targeted repairs solved the immediate problem, and my parents' savings account remained intact. Sometimes the best solution really is the simplest one, especially when it's developed through honest conversation between people who treat each other with mutual respect. Should professional expertise ever justify dismissive treatment of customer concerns? How often do we make assumptions about people based on their appearance or questions? And if you were in Rodriguez's position, would you have recognized your mistake and changed your approach? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story reminds you of a time when you were underestimated or had to advocate for family members, hit that like button and subscribe for daily stories about standing up for what's right. And if you know someone who's ever been dismissed by a contractor or service provider, send this video to them. What happened in my parents' kitchen didn't make headlines or go viral on social media, but it changed how at least one contractor treats his customers. And it reminded our family that respect is earned through character, not through the assumptions we make about other people's expertise or authority. 3 months after the plumbing incident, I was helping Mom organize her home office when she pulled out a manila folder she'd labeled Service Providers. Inside were business cards, estimates, and detailed notes about every contractor, repair person, and service professional they dealt with over the past few years. What surprised me wasn't that she'd kept such organized records, but the confidence evident in her handwritten observations. Rodriguez Plumbing, initially dismissive, much better after understanding customer background. Fair pricing once properly motivated. Would use again with clear expectations established up front. Below that, she'd noted the names of 2 other plumbing companies they'd contacted for comparison quotes, with detailed pros and cons of each approach. "When did you start keeping notes like this?" I asked, genuinely impressed by the thoroughness of her documentation. Mom looked slightly embarrassed, as if she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't admit to. After that whole situation with the kitchen sink, I realized we'd been too trusting with service people. Not suspicious exactly, but not asking the right questions either. Your father and I decided we needed to become better consumers. She showed me entries for their electrician, who'd initially quoted them $1,500 to upgrade their main electrical panel, but had revised his estimate to $800 when Mom started asking specific questions about code requirements versus optional improvements. There were notes about their HVAC technician, who tried to sell them a completely new system before admitting that a thorough cleaning and minor part replacement would solve their heating issues for another few years. "We've saved over $4,000 in the last 3 months just by asking for detailed explanations and getting multiple opinions," Dad added, looking up from his newspaper with obvious pride. Turns out, most of these problems aren't as complicated or expensive as people want us to believe. The transformation in my parents' approach to home maintenance was remarkable, but it was also somewhat concerning. How many years had they been overpaying for services because they trusted professional recommendations without question? How many other elderly homeowners were still making the same mistakes, accepting inflated estimates because they assumed contractors always knew best? I started thinking about this more seriously when Mrs. Chen from next door knocked on the door the following week. She was holding a crumpled estimate in her shaking hands, clearly upset about something related to her garage door repair. The quote she'd received was for $2,800 to replace what the contractor had described as a completely failed mechanical system that posed safety risks to her family. "Sarah, dear," she said nervously, "your mother mentioned that you helped them with some repair issues recently. Would you mind taking a look at this estimate? The numbers seem awfully high, but I don't understand garage doors well enough to know if this is reasonable." I examined the paperwork while Mrs. Chen explained the problem. Her garage door had started making grinding noises and occasionally sticking halfway up. The contractor had spent 15 minutes diagnosing the issue before declaring that the entire opener mechanism was failing and needed immediate replacement, along with new springs, cables, and safety sensors that weren't up to current code standards. The language in the estimate was designed to create urgency and discourage questions. Phrases like critical safety hazard and immediate replacement required were scattered throughout, along with technical specifications that would intimidate most homeowners. The contractor had scheduled installation for the following Monday, requiring full payment up front for materials and labor. "Has anyone else looked at this?" I asked. Mrs. Chen shook her head. "He said the problem was too dangerous to ignore, and that other companies would just tell me what I wanted to hear instead of giving me the truth about what needed to be done. He made it sound like getting another opinion would be wasting time while the situation got worse." The sales approach sounded familiar. create fear about safety risks, claim superior expertise, discourage comparison shopping, and push for immediate decisions. It was the same pattern Rodriguez had used with my parents, scaled up for a larger repair project. I suggested that Mrs. Chen contact 2 other garage door companies for evaluation before committing to such an expensive replacement.
She was hesitant, worried that the contractor might be right about safety concerns, but agreed to postpone the scheduled installation until she could gather more information. The second opinion revealed that Mrs. Chen's garage door opener was indeed having problems, but not the catastrophic failure the first contractor had described. The grinding noise was coming from worn rollers that needed replacement, and the sticking issue was caused by accumulated debris in the track system. Total repair cost? $340 for parts and labor, with work that could be completed in under 2 hours. Mrs. Chen was relieved about the cost savings, but she was also angry about being misled. "He looked me right in the eye and told me my family was in danger if I didn't replace everything immediately," she said. "How many other people is he frightening into unnecessary purchases?" That question stayed with me as I continued helping neighbors and friends evaluate various service estimates over the following months. What started as occasional assistance for my parents had evolved into an informal consulting role for anyone in their social circle who needed help navigating contractor relationships. The patterns were depressingly consistent. Elderly homeowners were quoted premium prices for comprehensive solutions to problems that could often be solved with targeted repairs. Young families were pressured into expensive upgrades disguised as safety necessities. Single women were talked down to and overcharged for services that male homeowners received at standard rates with respectful treatment. Mrs. Patterson, a widow in her 70s, had been quoted $4,500 for roof repairs that turned out to require less than $800 of actual work. The contractor had convinced her that small leaks indicated structural problems requiring partial roof replacement when the real issue was several loose shingles and a clogged gutter that was directing water into areas where it didn't belong. Tom and Lisa Morrison, a young couple with 2 small children, were told they needed a complete electrical system upgrade costing $12,000 to make their home safe for their family. The real problem was a single outdated circuit that needed updating to handle their modern appliances, a job that cost less than $1,500 and took 1 day to complete. Jennifer Walsh, recently divorced and learning to handle home maintenance on her own, had been quoted nearly $3,000 for furnace repairs that supposedly required immediate attention to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning. The actual problem was a dirty filter and faulty thermostat battery, fixed for under $200 by an honest technician who spent time explaining how to maintain the system properly. Each situation followed similar patterns of intimidation, overcomplication, and pressure tactics designed to prevent informed decision-making. Contractors counted on customers' lack of technical knowledge, their trust in professional expertise, and their fear of making mistakes that could endanger their families or cost them more money in the long run. What bothered me most wasn't just the financial exploitation, though that was serious enough. It was the way these interactions undermined people's confidence in their own judgment and their ability to advocate for themselves. After being condescended to or frightened by contractors, many homeowners started believing they were incapable of understanding their own repair needs or evaluating proposed solutions. I began developing what I privately called contractor evaluation protocols based on my military experience with vendor management and procurement oversight. The principles were straightforward. Request detailed explanations of diagnosed problems, ask for multiple solution options with different cost levels, require written estimates with specific timelines, and always get at least 2 opinions for major repairs. More importantly, I started teaching people how to recognize red flags in contractor behavior. Immediate pressure for decisions, refusal to provide written estimates, claims that other contractors were inferior or dishonest, and attempts to discourage comparison shopping were all warning signs of potentially predatory business practices. The techniques I'd learned for evaluating defense contractor proposals worked perfectly for civilian repair estimates. Ask probing questions about necessity versus preference, request justification for premium materials or comprehensive approaches, and never accept "trust me, I'm the expert" as sufficient explanation for expensive recommendations. Word of mouth in suburban neighborhoods travels faster than social media, and soon I was getting calls from people I'd never met asking for help with contractor evaluations. Sarah Thompson called about a driveway ceiling estimate that seemed excessive. Mike Rodriguez, no relation to the plumber, wanted advice about a tree removal quote that included services he wasn't sure he needed. Each conversation reinforced my growing understanding of how widespread these problems were. Honest contractors existed, but they were competing in a marketplace where aggressive sales tactics and inflated pricing had become standard practice for too many service providers. Customers who didn't know how to push back were systematically overcharged, while those who asked difficult questions were often treated with irritation or condescension. The situation reminded me of procurement challenges I'd faced in military settings, where vendor relationships required constant vigilance to ensure fair pricing and appropriate service delivery. The difference was that military procurement had built-in oversight mechanisms and standardized evaluation procedures, while individual homeowners were largely on their own when dealing with service providers. I started wondering if there was a way to level the playing field for consumers who lacked the confidence or knowledge to advocate effectively for themselves. Community education seemed like one possibility, teaching people how to research contractors, evaluate estimates, and recognize common sales manipulation tactics. The local community center was interested in hosting a workshop on consumer protection for home repair services, and 23 people showed up for the first session. Most were elderly homeowners or single parents who'd had negative experiences with contractors and wanted to protect themselves from future exploitation. During that first workshop, I presented the same systematic approach to vendor evaluation that I'd used for military procurement decisions. We practiced asking the right questions, recognizing pressure tactics, and developing confidence in their own judgment about repair necessities versus optional upgrades. The feedback was overwhelmingly positive, but what surprised me was how many attendees shared stories about contractors who changed their approach dramatically once they understood they were dealing with informed consumers. Simply asking detailed questions and requesting written documentation was often enough to transform aggressive salespeople into respectful service providers. Maria Gonzalez mentioned that a roofing contractor had revised his estimate downward by 30% after she started asking specific questions about material specifications and labor costs. He realized I wasn't going to just accept whatever he told me, she explained, so he started treating me like a real customer instead of an easy mark. Frank Williams described how an HVAC technician had switched from pushing a complete system replacement to recommending a series of smaller repairs spread over 2 years, saving Frank nearly $8,000 while still addressing his heating and cooling needs effectively. These stories illustrated something important about contractor relationships. Many service providers weren't intentionally predatory, but they developed habits of overselling because most customers didn't push back on their recommendations. When faced with informed consumers who asked pointed questions, many contractors were perfectly willing to provide honest assessments and fair pricing. The workshop series expanded to 4 sessions, covering different aspects of consumer protection and contractor evaluation. We discussed research techniques for verifying licenses and checking references, negotiation strategies for getting fair pricing, and documentation practices for protecting yourself if service work went wrong.
By the third session, attendees were bringing their own success stories about applying these techniques to real-world situations. Barbara Chen had negotiated a fair price for bathroom tile repair after initially being quoted twice what the work should cost. David Park had avoided a $12,000 flooring replacement by asking detailed questions that revealed much less expensive solutions to his hardwood problems. The most gratifying stories came from people who'd gained confidence in their own judgment about home maintenance needs. Instead of accepting contractor recommendations without question, they were learning to evaluate proposals based on their actual circumstances and priorities rather than fear-based sales presentations. One woman, Linda Patterson, shared how she'd handled a recent interaction with a landscaping contractor who'd tried to pressure her into expensive drainage work.
I asked him to explain exactly why he thought the drainage was necessary, what would happen if I waited 6 months, and what the minimum effective solution would cost, she said. When he couldn't give me satisfactory answers, I thanked him for his time and got 2 more opinions. The second and third contractors had confirmed that Linda's yard drainage was functioning adequately and didn't require immediate intervention. The expensive solution the first contractor had recommended was based on worst-case scenarios that were unlikely to affect her property given its elevation and soil conditions. These workshop sessions reminded me why I'd always valued straightforward communication and honest assessment in my military career. Whether you're evaluating equipment proposals from defense contractors or home repair estimates from local service providers, the same principles applied. Ask questions, seek alternatives, demand clear explanations, and never let anyone dismiss your concerns as uninformed or unreasonable. The skills that had served me well in managing complex military logistics operations transferred perfectly to civilian consumer protection. Understanding vendor motivations, recognizing sales manipulation tactics, and maintaining professional skepticism about expensive recommendations were valuable abilities regardless of the context. What started as helping my parents with a plumbing problem had evolved into a broader understanding of how power dynamics affected consumer relationships and how individual confidence could change the entire nature of service transactions. When customers knew how to advocate for themselves, contractors had to compete on the basis of honest service delivery rather than intimidation and overpricing. The ripple effects continued expanding throughout the community. People who'd attended the workshops were sharing techniques with friends and family members, creating a network of informed consumers who expected respectful treatment and fair pricing from service providers. Local contractors began noticing that their customers were asking more sophisticated questions and requesting more detailed justification for expensive recommendations. Several honest service providers mentioned that they appreciated working with better-informed consumers because it allowed them to focus on delivering quality service rather than managing customer fears and misconceptions. Rodriguez Plumbing had become one of the most recommended contractors in the neighborhood, not because he was the cheapest, but because he'd learned to present options clearly and respect customers' financial concerns. His business had grown significantly since he'd changed his approach to customer interactions, proving that honest service delivery was not just morally superior, but also economically beneficial. The transformation in my parents' confidence as consumers had been particularly rewarding to witness. They'd gone from accepting contractor recommendations without question to becoming sophisticated evaluators of service proposals who got multiple opinions, negotiated fair prices, and made informed decisions based on their actual needs rather than fear-based sales presentations. Their friends and neighbors had noticed the change, leading to more requests for advice about contractor relationships and home maintenance decisions. What had started as a single plumbing emergency had become an ongoing education in consumer empowerment and professional relationship management. The experience reinforced something I'd learned throughout my military career about the importance of clear communication and mutual respect in professional relationships. Whether you're coordinating with defense contractors or dealing with local service providers, the same principles applied. Both parties benefited when interactions were based on honest assessment, fair pricing, and respectful treatment rather than manipulation, intimidation, or assumption-based stereotyping. Sometimes the most important changes happen one conversation at a time, one interaction at a time, one person learning to ask better questions and expect better treatment. What happened in my parents' kitchen had sparked a broader transformation in how an entire community approached contractor relationships, creating lasting benefits for everyone involved. 6 months later, I was sitting in my favorite coffee shop downtown when Rodriguez walked in, scanning the room nervously like he was looking for someone specific. When he spotted me in the corner booth, his face broke into a smile that seemed genuinely relieved. He approached my table with the kind of careful confidence that suggested he'd been planning this encounter for a while. "Colonel Anderson," he said, using the formal address even though I was dressed in civilian clothes and reading a weekend newspaper, "I've been hoping to run into you. Would you mind if I joined you for a few minutes? There's something I'd like to share with you." I gestured to the empty chair across from me, curious about what had prompted this unexpected meeting. Rodriguez looked different from the man who'd stood in my parents' driveway arguing about plumbing estimates. His uniform shirt was still professional, but his demeanor carried a humility that hadn't been present during our original interaction. "I wanted you to know that our conversation changed more than just how I work with your parents," he began, setting his coffee cup down carefully. "It changed how I think about every customer interaction, every estimate I provide, every recommendation I make. I've been doing this work for 15 years, but I realized I'd never really considered how my approach might affect people who don't have your background or confidence." He pulled out his phone and showed me a customer review website where Rodriguez Plumbing had accumulated dozens of 5-star ratings over the past several months. The comments were remarkably consistent in praising his thorough explanations, fair pricing, and respectful treatment of customer concerns. One review specifically mentioned how he'd taken extra time to explain different repair options and help the customer choose the approach that best fit their budget and timeline. "These are from customers who would have gotten very different service 6 months ago," Rodriguez admitted. "I was so focused on demonstrating my expertise that I forgot the purpose was supposed to be helping people solve their problems, not proving how much more I knew than they did." I scanned through several of the reviews, noting language that suggested genuine customer satisfaction rather than generic appreciation for completed work. People were commenting on feeling heard, respected, and confident in their repair decisions. Several mentioned that Rodriguez had saved them money by recommending targeted fixes instead of comprehensive overhauls. "What specifically changed in your approach?" I asked, genuinely interested in understanding how professional behavior modification worked in civilian service industries. Rodriguez considered the question carefully. "I started listening differently," he said. "When someone expresses concern about costs, instead of hearing that as resistance to my recommendations, I hear it as valuable information about what kind of solution will actually work for their situation. When someone asks for a second opinion, instead of taking it as questioning my competence, I see it as them being responsible consumers."
He described how he'd restructured his diagnostic process to include multiple repair options at different price points, allowing customers to make informed decisions based on their priorities and financial constraints. Instead of presenting single comprehensive solutions, he now explained the minimum necessary repairs, optimal long-term approaches, and various compromise positions between those extremes. "The interesting thing," Rodriguez continued, "is that treating customers this way has actually been better for my business. People trust me more, so they're more likely to approve necessary work. They recommend me to friends because they feel like I'm looking out for their interests. And I get more repeat business because customers know I'll be straight with them about what really needs attention." This insight aligned with something I'd observed throughout my military career about leadership effectiveness. Officers who built trust through honest assessment and genuine concern for their personnel's welfare were more successful at accomplishing missions than those who relied on authority and intimidation. The same principles apparently applied to civilian service relationships. Rodriguez mentioned that he'd started incorporating some of my questions into his own diagnostic conversations with customers. He would ask homeowners about their long-term plans for the property, their current financial priorities, and their comfort level with different types of maintenance responsibilities. This information helped him tailor recommendations that actually served their needs rather than maximizing his project revenues. "I have to ask," I said, "how did other contractors in your network react to this change in approach? Was there pressure to maintain the previous sales model?" Rodriguez laughed, but without the cynicism I might have expected. "Some guys thought I was crazy for leaving money on the table by not pushing premium solutions. But the ones who tried similar approaches started seeing the same results I did. Better customer relationships, more referrals, higher satisfaction ratings. It turns out that honest service delivery isn't just morally superior, it's also more sustainable as a business model." He described informal conversations with other contractors who'd begun questioning their own customer interaction patterns. A roofing specialist had started presenting repair versus replacement options more clearly. An electrician had begun explaining code requirements separately from optional upgrades.
An HVAC technician had developed a systematic approach to helping customers prioritize system improvements based on their actual usage patterns and budget constraints. The whole industry dynamic is shifting, Rodriguez observed. At least in this area. Customers are asking better questions, so contractors have to compete on the basis of genuine expertise and fair service rather than fear-based sales tactics. The guys who refuse to adapt are finding it harder to maintain their customer base. This market evolution fascinated me because it demonstrated how individual consumer education could create systemic changes in industry practices. When enough customers demanded respectful treatment and transparent pricing, service providers had to modify their approaches to remain competitive. The workshops I'd conducted had contributed to this transformation, but the real change was happening through countless individual interactions where informed consumers expected professional behavior. Rodriguez mentioned that he'd been asked to speak at a trade association meeting about customer relationship management and ethical sales practices. They want me to share what I learned about building trust with customers instead of pressuring them into expensive solutions, he said. A year ago, I would have thought that was naive. Now I realize it's just good business. After Rodriguez left, I found myself reflecting on how this entire experience had changed my own perspective on civilian life and community engagement. My military career had been focused on large-scale operations and strategic objectives. But this situation had shown me how individual interactions could create ripple effects that transformed entire communities. The neighborhood where my parents lived had become noticeably different in terms of how residents approached contractor relationships. There was more communication between neighbors about service experiences, more willingness to share recommendations and warnings, and more confidence in challenging questionable business practices. What had started as one family's plumbing problem had evolved into a community-wide shift toward informed consumerism. Mrs. Chen had become something of a local expert on contractor evaluation, helping other neighbors apply systematic approaches to service estimates. She'd successfully negotiated fair pricing on her own garage door repair and had since assisted 3 other families in avoiding overpriced solutions to their maintenance needs. Her confidence as a consumer had grown dramatically, and she'd begun taking on home improvement projects she would have previously considered beyond her capabilities. The Morrison family had used their experience with electrical contractor evaluation to tackle several other home maintenance challenges with much better results. Instead of accepting expensive comprehensive solutions, they'd learned to prioritize repairs based on safety requirements versus convenience improvements, saving thousands of dollars while still addressing their family's needs effectively. Jennifer Walsh had become particularly skilled at researching contractors and evaluating service proposals. She'd developed her own checklist for vetting potential service providers and had begun sharing her techniques with other single women who faced similar challenges in contractor relationships. Her confidence in handling home maintenance decisions had grown to the point where she was considering more ambitious renovation projects. These individual success stories reflected broader changes in community dynamics around consumer empowerment and professional service relationships. People were no longer accepting condescending treatment or inflated pricing simply because they lacked technical expertise. They'd learned to ask probing questions, seek multiple opinions, and trust their own judgment about reasonable solutions to their problems. The transformation reminded me of leadership lessons I'd learned about empowering subordinates to make informed decisions rather than simply following orders without understanding. When people understood the reasoning behind recommendations, they could evaluate proposals intelligently and contribute to better outcomes for everyone involved. I'd been invited to speak at several other community organizations about consumer protection and contractor evaluation. These presentations had evolved into broader discussions about professional respect, clear communication, and the importance of treating every interaction as an opportunity to build trust rather than demonstrate authority. The military leadership principles that had guided my career translated surprisingly well to civilian consumer advocacy. Asking probing questions, seeking multiple perspectives, maintaining professional skepticism about expensive recommendations, and insisting on clear explanations were valuable skills regardless of the context.
What struck me most about this entire experience was how assumptions about people's capabilities and authority could shape professional interactions so dramatically. Rodriguez had treated me dismissively when he saw a middle-aged woman in casual clothes asking about repair costs, but had become respectful and accommodating once he understood my professional background. The problem wasn't just that his initial assessment was wrong, but that respectful treatment should never have been contingent on my military rank in the first place. This realization had broader implications for how we evaluate people's expertise and deserve consideration in professional settings. How many individuals were dismissed or condescended to because they didn't project obvious authority or professional credentials? How many good ideas were ignored because they came from people who seemed less important or knowledgeable than the recognized experts in the room? My parents had internalized these lessons in ways that extended beyond contractor relationships. Dad had become more assertive in medical appointments, asking detailed questions about treatment recommendations and requesting explanations of diagnostic procedures. Mom had started challenging financial service providers about fees and investment advice instead of simply accepting whatever bank representatives recommended. Their friends had noticed these changes and had begun applying similar approaches to their own professional interactions. Dr. Henderson mentioned that his elderly patients had become more engaged in treatment discussions, asking better questions about medication options and therapy alternatives. The local bank manager had observed that senior customers were requesting more detailed explanations of financial products instead of relying solely on staff recommendations. These shifts represented more than improved consumer behavior. They reflected a fundamental change in how people understood their own authority to ask questions and expect respectful treatment from service providers. The confidence to challenge professional recommendations when they seemed unreasonable or excessive was spreading throughout the community like a positive contagion. I began to understand that my military experience had given me advantages in civilian interactions that I'd never fully appreciated. 22 years of managing complex projects and evaluating expert recommendations had prepared me to ask the right questions and recognize unreasonable proposals. But most civilians hadn't developed these skills through their work experiences. The workshops and informal consulting I'd been doing represented an attempt to share some of these capabilities with people who could benefit from more systematic approaches to contractor evaluation and professional relationship management. But the real value was in helping people develop confidence in their own judgment and authority to expect respectful treatment from service providers. 6 months after the plumbing incident, I received a call from the mayor's office asking if I'd be interested in joining a consumer protection task force focused on home repair service regulation. The city had received numerous complaints about contractor pricing and sales practices, and they wanted to develop policies that would protect residents from predatory business behavior while supporting legitimate service providers. The task force included representatives from various professional trades, consumer advocacy organizations, and city regulatory departments. Our mandate was to develop guidelines for contractor licensing, advertising standards, and dispute resolution procedures that would balance business interests with consumer protection. During our first meeting, I was surprised to learn that several other task force members had military backgrounds and had noticed similar patterns of civilian contractor behavior that differed significantly from their experiences with defense industry vendors. The structured procurement processes and vendor accountability measures common in military contracting could potentially be adapted for civilian consumer protection. Rodriguez had been invited to participate as a representative of small business contractors who supported higher industry standards. His transformation from aggressive salesperson to customer-focused service provider made him a valuable voice for ethical business practices that could still be profitable and competitive. The discussions were fascinating because they revealed how individual behavior changes could scale up to community-wide improvements in professional service delivery. When enough consumers demanded respectful treatment and transparent pricing, the entire market dynamic shifted toward higher standards of business conduct. We developed recommendations for contractor education programs focused on customer relationship management and ethical sales practices. We proposed disclosure requirements for service estimates that would help consumers understand the difference between necessary repairs and optional improvements. We suggested dispute resolution procedures that would protect both customers and contractors from misunderstandings and unreasonable demands.
The task force work reminded me of policy development processes I'd participated in during my military career, where individual experiences and insights were synthesized into systematic approaches that could benefit broader populations. The same analytical skills that had served me well in strategic planning translated effectively to civilian consumer protection initiatives. Working with the task force also reinforced my appreciation for the collaborative problem-solving that was possible when people from different backgrounds brought their expertise to addressing common challenges. Rodriguez's practical experience with customer interactions, combined with regulatory specialists' knowledge of legal frameworks and consumer advocates' understanding of protection needs, created more comprehensive solutions than any single perspective could have developed alone. The final task force report included recommendations that were eventually adopted as city policy, creating new standards for contractor licensing, advertising disclosure, and customer service training. The changes weren't dramatic or revolutionary, but they established baseline expectations for professional behavior that supported both consumers and honest service providers. Rodriguez mentioned that the new standards had made his job easier because they created a level playing field where all contractors had to meet similar disclosure and customer service requirements. Now everyone has to compete on the basis of actual service quality instead of sales manipulation, he observed. That's better for customers and better for contractors who want to build legitimate businesses. Looking back on the entire experience, from that first morning when Mom called about the kitchen sink leak to the implementation of citywide consumer protection policies, I was struck by how individual interactions could create lasting changes that extended far beyond the original participants. What had started as a simple home repair problem had evolved into a community education initiative, then a systematic approach to consumer empowerment, and finally a policy framework for protecting residents from predatory business practices. Each stage had built on previous developments while creating new opportunities for positive change. The core lesson remained consistent throughout all these developments. Respectful treatment and honest communication were not just moral imperatives, but also practical necessities for building sustainable professional relationships. Whether the interaction involved military contractors, civilian service providers, or community policy development, the same principles applied. Rodriguez had learned that treating customers with respect and providing transparent pricing led to better business outcomes than intimidation and overcharging. Community residents had discovered that asking probing questions and expecting professional behavior resulted in better service and fairer pricing. City policymakers had recognized that establishing clear standards for contractor behavior benefited everyone involved in home repair transactions. My parents still live in the same house with the same kitchen sink that had started this entire chain of events. But they approached contractor relationships with confidence and sophistication that had transformed their experiences as consumers. More importantly, they'd become part of a community network that supported informed decision-making and mutual assistance in navigating professional service relationships. The story didn't have a dramatic conclusion with villains punished and heroes celebrated. Instead, it demonstrated how individual encounters could create systemic improvements when people were willing to learn from their experiences and share their insights with others. Rodriguez became a better contractor, customers became more informed consumers, and the entire community developed higher standards for professional service delivery. Sometimes the most meaningful changes happen quietly, through countless individual encounters where people choose to treat each other with respect and honesty instead of pursuing short-term advantages through manipulation or intimidation. What happened in my parents' kitchen had rippled outward to touch hundreds of other families and dozens of service providers, creating lasting improvements in how professional relationships functioned throughout the community. The experience had also changed my understanding of how military leadership skills could contribute to civilian community development. The same capabilities that had served me well in managing complex operations and building effective teams were valuable for consumer advocacy, policy development, and community education initiatives. Transitioning from military to civilian life often focused on translating technical skills and professional credentials. But this experience had shown me that the interpersonal and analytical capabilities developed through military service could create significant value in unexpected contexts. Sometimes, the most important contributions came from applying systematic thinking and principled leadership to everyday challenges that affected ordinary people's lives. The kitchen sink worked perfectly, by the way. $750 of targeted repairs had solved the immediate problem, and my parents' confidence in handling future maintenance challenges had grown exponentially. Sometimes the best solutions really were the simplest ones, especially when they emerged from honest conversations between people who treated each other with mutual respect and professional courtesy. 2 years after the kitchen sink incident, I was preparing for my retirement ceremony when my assistant handed me a letter that had arrived through official military channels. The return address showed Rodriguez Plumbing, but the formal letterhead and military routing suggested something more significant than a standard business correspondence. Inside, Rodriguez had written a detailed account of how our encounter had influenced his decision to start a non-profit organization focused on teaching home maintenance skills to military families transitioning to civilian life. He'd partnered with local veterans organizations to provide workshops on contractor evaluation, basic repair techniques, and consumer protection strategies specifically tailored for service members who were learning to navigate civilian homeownership. Colonel Anderson, his letter began, "You probably don't realize the full impact of what happened that day at your parents' house. Your approach to problem-solving and professional communication became a model for how I wanted to conduct my business and contribute to my community. I've been working with transitioning veterans for 18 months now, and I wanted you to know that the principles you demonstrated have helped dozens of military families avoid the mistakes I used to encourage in my own customers." He described workshop sessions where he taught retired sergeants and discharged corporals how to spot inflated estimates and demand respectful treatment from service providers. Many of these veterans had technical skills from their military training but lacked experience with civilian contractor relationships and consumer protection strategies. Rodriguez had developed curricula that combined practical home maintenance education with the kind of systematic evaluation approaches I'd shared with community members. The letter included testimonials from workshop participants who'd successfully negotiated fair pricing on major home repairs, avoided unnecessary services, and developed confidence in managing their properties as civilian homeowners. Several mentioned that Rodriguez's emphasis on clear communication and mutual respect had helped them transition from military command structures to collaborative civilian relationships with service providers. One testimonial particularly caught my attention. Master Sergeant Williams, recently retired after 30 years of military service, had used workshop techniques to evaluate contractors for his bathroom renovation project. "Rodriguez taught me to ask the same kinds of probing questions Colonel Anderson would have asked," Williams wrote. "The difference in how contractors treated me once they realized I knew what I was talking about was remarkable. Instead of trying to oversell me, they competed on providing the best value and most professional service." Reading these accounts, I realized that the skills I'd taken for granted from decades of military project management were genuinely valuable for civilians navigating contractor relationships. The systematic approach to vendor evaluation, the confidence to ask detailed questions, and the expectation of respectful professional treatment weren't universal capabilities, but they could be taught and learned by people who needed them. Rodriguez's letter continued with updates about his business transformation and its effects on the broader contractor community. His company had become a preferred vendor for several veterans organizations, not because he offered the lowest prices, but because his approach to customer education and transparent pricing aligned with military values of integrity and straightforward communication. "Other contractors in the area have started adopting similar approaches," he wrote, "because they've seen how my customer satisfaction ratings and referral business have grown. The veterans I work with expect professional behavior and honest assessments, so contractors who deal with military families have had to raise their standards across the board." This market evolution reflected something I'd observed throughout my military career about how institutional standards could influence entire professional environments. When military units maintained high expectations for contractor performance, civilian vendors had to meet those standards to secure and maintain defense contracts. The same dynamic apparently applied to civilian service relationships when customers had clear expectations and the confidence to enforce them. The letter concluded with an invitation to speak at Rodriguez's next veteran workshop series, which would focus specifically on home maintenance and contractor relationships for female service members transitioning to civilian life. He'd noticed that women veterans faced additional challenges in contractor interactions, often dealing with condescending treatment and inflated pricing that male veterans didn't encounter as frequently. This observation aligned with my own experiences and those of other female officers I'd known throughout my career. Professional competence didn't always translate to respectful treatment in civilian contexts, especially in traditionally male-dominated service industries like plumbing, electrical work, and automotive repair. The workshop series could provide women veterans with specific strategies for commanding respect and fair treatment from contractors who might otherwise assume they could be intimidated or overcharged. I accepted Rodriguez's invitation and found myself presenting to a group of 25 female veterans ranging from recently discharged privates to retired senior non-commissioned officers. Their questions were sharp, practical, and focused on real-world challenges they'd encountered in civilian contractor relationships. Sergeant First Class Martinez, recently retired after 3 tours in Afghanistan, described how an auto repair shop had initially quoted her $1,500 for brake work that should have cost less than $400. They changed their tune completely when I started asking specific questions about part specifications and labor procedures, she said. Suddenly, they found ways to do the same work for a fraction of the original estimate. Captain Thompson, who'd transitioned from military intelligence to civilian life 6 months earlier, had used systematic evaluation techniques to choose contractors for her first home purchase. I treated contractor selection like mission planning, she explained. Multiple sources of information, detailed risk assessment, clear success criteria. The contractors who couldn't handle that level of scrutiny weren't the ones I wanted working on my house anyway. These women had developed their own adaptations of military problem-solving approaches for civilian contractor management. They understood that professional competence required assertive communication, thorough preparation, and willingness to walk away from unsatisfying service providers. Their military experience had given them confidence to expect respectful treatment and fair pricing even when contractors initially assumed otherwise. The workshop discussions revealed broader patterns about how military service prepared people for civilian consumer advocacy. Veterans understood hierarchical communication, systematic evaluation procedures, and the importance of clear expectations in professional relationships. These capabilities transferred directly to contractor interactions, but many transitioning service members didn't realize how valuable their military-developed skills were in civilian contexts. Rodriguez had structured his workshops to help veterans recognize these transferable competencies and apply them systematically to home maintenance challenges. His approach combined practical technical education with consumer protection strategies, creating comprehensive preparation for civilian homeownership responsibilities. During the break between workshop sessions, I had an opportunity to observe Rodriguez working with individual participants on specific contractor evaluation scenarios. His teaching style had evolved considerably from the condescending expert who'd stood in my parents' driveway 2 years ago. He listened carefully to each person's concerns, asked clarifying questions about their situations, and provided tailored advice that respected their individual circumstances and priorities. The key insight, Rodriguez explained to one workshop participant, is that contractors work for you, not the other way around. Your military experience taught you how to evaluate vendor performance and hold people accountable for professional standards. Those same skills apply perfectly to civilian contractor relationships. This perspective represented a fundamental shift from his original approach to customer interactions. Instead of positioning himself as the unquestionable expert whose recommendations should be accepted without scrutiny, he now empowered customers to become informed evaluators of service proposals and active participants in repair decisions. After the workshop concluded, Rodriguez and I discussed how this community education model might be expanded to other veteran populations and civilian groups. The techniques that worked for transitioning military families could potentially benefit other consumers who faced similar challenges in contractor relationships. I've been thinking about developing workshops for senior citizens, Rodriguez mentioned, because they face many of the same issues with condescending treatment and inflated pricing that military families encounter. The evaluation techniques are essentially the same, but the communication approaches might need some modification. This expansion possibility interested me because it connected to the broader community education work I'd been doing since my parents' plumbing incident. The systematic approaches that helped veterans navigate contractor relationships could benefit any consumers who wanted to become more effective advocates for themselves in professional service transactions. Over the following months, Rodriguez's workshop series expanded to include senior citizens, single parents, and recent college graduates who were learning to manage their first independent housing situations. Each group faced unique challenges in contractor relationships, but the core principles remained consistent. Ask detailed questions, seek multiple opinions, expect respectful treatment, and trust your own judgment about reasonable solutions. The community impact was remarkable to observe. Neighborhood contractor relationships had evolved toward higher standards of professional behavior and transparent pricing. Service providers who maintained ethical business practices saw increased customer loyalty and referral business, while those who relied on intimidation and overcharging found their market share declining as consumers became more sophisticated. My parents had become unofficial consultants for their entire social network, helping friends and neighbors apply systematic evaluation techniques to various service needs. Their confidence as consumers had grown to the point where they were tackling home improvement projects they would have previously considered beyond their capabilities or financial resources. The difference isn't that we've become experts in plumbing or electrical work, Mom explained during a family dinner. The difference is that we've learned how to evaluate expert recommendations and make informed decisions about what's actually necessary versus what's just convenient for the contractor. This insight captured something essential about consumer empowerment and professional relationship management. The goal wasn't to become technical experts in every field, but to develop sufficient evaluation skills to distinguish between legitimate professional advice and sales manipulation disguised as expertise. As my military retirement approached, I found myself reflecting on how individual encounters could create lasting changes that extended far beyond their original participants. What had started as a frustrating interaction with a condescending contractor had evolved into community education initiatives, policy development work, and systematic approaches to consumer protection that had benefited hundreds of families. Rodriguez had transformed from an aggressive salesperson into a community educator who helped veterans and civilians develop confidence in contractor relationships. My parents had evolved from trusting consumers who accepted professional recommendations without question into sophisticated evaluators who made informed decisions based on their actual needs and priorities. The broader neighborhood had developed a culture of mutual support and information sharing that improved outcomes for everyone dealing with service providers. Contractors who maintained ethical business practices thrived in this environment, while those who relied on intimidation and overcharging found it increasingly difficult to maintain their customer base. My parents had become unofficial consultants for their entire social network, helping friends and neighbors apply systematic evaluation techniques to various service needs. Their friends' confidence as consumers had grown to the point where they were tackling home improvement projects they would have previously considered beyond their capabilities or financial resources. The difference isn't that we've become experts in plumbing or electrical work, Mom explained during a family dinner. The difference is that we've learned how to evaluate expert recommendations and make informed decisions about what's actually necessary versus what's just convenient for the contractor. This insight captured something essential about consumer empowerment and professional relationship management. The goal wasn't to become technical experts in every field, but to develop sufficient evaluation skills to distinguish between legitimate professional advice and sales manipulation disguised as expertise. As my military retirement approached, I found myself reflecting on how individual encounters could create lasting changes that extended far beyond their original participants. What had started as a frustrating interaction with a condescending contractor had evolved into community education initiatives, policy development work, and systematic approaches to consumer protection that had benefited hundreds of families. Rodriguez had transformed from an aggressive salesperson into a community educator who helped veterans and civilians develop confidence in contractor relationships. My parents had evolved from trusting consumers who accepted professional recommendations without question into sophisticated evaluators who made informed decisions based on their actual needs and priorities. The broader neighborhood had developed a culture of mutual support and information sharing that improved outcomes for everyone dealing with service providers. Contractors who maintained ethical business practices thrived in this environment, while those who relied on intimidation and overcharging found it increasingly difficult to maintain their customer base. My parents had become unofficial consultants for their entire social network, helping friends and neighbors apply systematic evaluation techniques to various service needs. Their confidence as consumers had grown to the point where they were tackling home improvement projects they would have previously considered beyond their capabilities or financial resources. The difference isn't that we've become experts in plumbing or electrical work, Mom explained during a family dinner. The difference is that we've learned how to evaluate expert recommendations and make informed decisions about what's actually necessary versus what's just convenient for the contractor. This insight captured something essential about consumer empowerment and professional relationship management. The goal wasn't to become technical experts in every field, but to develop sufficient evaluation skills to distinguish between legitimate professional advice and sales manipulation disguised as expertise. As my military retirement approached, I found myself reflecting on how individual encounters could create lasting changes that extended far beyond their original participants. What had started as a frustrating interaction with a condescending contractor had evolved into community education initiatives, policy development work, and systematic approaches to consumer protection that had benefited hundreds of families. Rodriguez had transformed from an aggressive salesperson into a community educator who helped veterans and civilians develop confidence in contractor relationships. My parents had evolved from trusting consumers who accepted professional recommendations without question into sophisticated evaluators who made informed decisions based on their actual needs and priorities. The broader neighborhood had developed a culture of mutual support and information sharing that improved outcomes for everyone dealing with service providers. Contractors who maintained ethical business practices thrived in this environment, while those who relied on intimidation and overcharging found it increasingly difficult to maintain their customer base. The story had no dramatic conclusion with villains defeated and heroes celebrated. Instead, it demonstrated how individual encounters could create systemic improvements when people were willing to learn from their experiences and share those insights with people who could benefit from different perspectives. Sometimes the most meaningful changes happened quietly, through countless daily interactions where people chose to treat each other with respect and honesty instead of pursuing short-term advantages through manipulation or intimidation. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.